what would your advice be in terms of best practices to ensure that the CAC is under control and CAC creep doesn't happen?
Yeah. I mean, I would remind everyone that CAC is not I think boards and CEOs oftentimes treat it as a voodoo, like CAC, we must, it's like the weather. It's like, oh my gosh, it started raining today. Like, we truly don't control the weather, right? CAC is very much something that people can control. And oftentimes the reason it creeps is because organizations are not testing and experimenting enough. So here's a simple example, right? If you have a landing page, conversion rate has a half-life. Right. So like if you have the same conversion rate a year later, half the number of people will convert on it because either they've seen it or it's using last year's, like whatever it is, has a half-life, right? Mm-hmm. And so creep or whatever, it's not an accident. It's usually because the teams aren't. So anyway, to answer your question, best practices, heavy experimentation, both in channels as well as in other channels. So testing new channels as well as testing old channels, making significant investments in organic things. Email is a big one. SEO is a big one. Referral programs are a big one. And I think like also making sure the company and the culture and the organization don't orient too much towards growth, because again, sometimes growth is easier than economics, and instead they really orient towards economics. That's just a cultural thing I've seen a lot, where people orient to growth, and you'll see people making completely stupid decisions to hit certain subscriber numbers or something. Just because culturally that's the thing that's important.
Got it. Would just like to double click on the experimentation aspect, experimentation and the focus on data. It's something that, we work with our companies on as well, but would like to understand your views on this. Again, the context here is, we're talking about brands that are very young and probably, spending not more than $1-2 million annually and working with is there a framework that you would suggest in terms of how they should think about experimentation, be it the number of parameters, the number of tests, velocity of tests, etc.? Because there's always this concern that, you might end up boiling the ocean and, getting drowned in data. So
I think that's a great question, because I see a lot of teams getting lost in this. Yeah. I'll throw out a couple just rules of thumbs. I think on Facebook, you should be testing 25 to 50 new creative a month and like 2 to 4 new conversion and landing experiences per month. So that's just that's an input side, what you should be producing every month. I think the concept testing is actually very expensive because you only have a certain amount of traffic and you can only show it to a certain amount of things. Right. And, I think it's important early on, especially to figure out kind of what does a win actually look like? What are you actually aiming for when it comes to a win, right? So we'll use, we use no genius framework like the ICE framework, which is impact, confidence, ease, which I'm sure most people know. But impact is, all of these should be things that take you 5 minutes to answer. There's no analysis done here. Like impact is, if it works, how big is it? Big, medium, small. Confidence is usually if you've done something like this before and it's worked, high confidence. If you've sometimes had ones work and some haven't, then you're paying medium. And if you've never, it's a totally brand new test, then it's low. And sometimes we do 30, 60, 90. And then ease is a cost or timeline thing. How expensive or how is it going to take 10 developers to redo the whole flow, or is it going to be, just a quick change of the landing page that's super easy to do? And obviously there's some finesse in like thinking through that. It's not just a math equation, but it's thinking through what to pick there. But I think, I think where a lot of people get caught up is, most companies at this stage should not be testing for significance. They see math. We all love let's do math. Let's get the numbers really right. What's a confidence interval? And there's a time for that. And Ampush does a lot of stuff like that because the scale is a little bit different. At this scale, be testing stuff that's big enough on the impact scale that it's easy to measure whether it worked or not.
Right.
And if you're getting to, the way I like one visual I always like to people is like the clay spinning on the wheel. Like $1 million media spending business is not a finely crafted piece of clay that you're now digging in and doing the specific thing. It's still like you're chopping off big slices of it and saying so I would make sure your ambition is shooting high enough such that if it works or doesn't work, and that you're in other words, you're going for 50 to 100% wins. You're not going for 5 to 10% wins. If you're going for 5 or 10% wins, $1 million company, that's going to be a real challenge, right? And so I think that's a really important thing to take home. And one related point to that is that we use this other framework called Champion Challenger. which is sort of like you have a champion creative or a champion flow, and you're adding a challenger into a Facebook mix or into a campaign and seeing that actually wins. Like it can overcome the current winner in some way. And that's also a great sign that you're doing something that's so different or so meaningfully better that it's going to, and if it's not, then you're like, oh, it's not clear that it's the winner and therefore it's not the winner. So that's a kind of a simple version of what I'm saying, which is like, you got to kind of swing big. And it shouldn't be, if you're getting into complex math and stats to prove like you're probably, you probably already lost the game a little bit.